Hello everyone, this is Randy again from Olds Diesel Channel. Tonight I wanted to talk to you for a few things about the Olds 350 diesel, some of the misconceptions, a lot of the problems that occurred with the engine throughout its life. The original research and development on the Olds 350 started around 1973. That coincidentally was the same time of the oil embargo in the early 70s all across the U.S. I can remember as a little boy standing in line with a little gallon or 2 gallon jug in line to get gas for 4 or 5 hours because that's all you were allowed. It was just like during wartime. They rationed the gasoline and diesel back then. Well, I shouldn't say not so much diesel, but the gas. Yeah. Well, most of your car manufacturers were trying to come up and think of a way. How can we come up with a vehicle or a car that gets astronomical mileage with the least consumption of fuel? Well, during that time, diesel fuel was about 15-16 cents a gallon, which is extremely cheap. So General Motors thought, which car line can we take and come up with something that will work? Well, GM had looked at some European manufacturers to see what they were doing. One in particular was Mercedes. They had an inline six-cylinder and a naturally aspirated version and also a turbocharged version that was doing quite well, which eventually come out to be the 300 and the 300D and the 300 turbo diesel. Well, it was an inline, and most of GM's chassis wouldn't accomplish or be kin to that long engine. And so they turned to Oldsmobile for one reason in particular. Oldsmobile used a lot of nickel in their casting process of their engines, which it created a very strong block and a heavy-duty block. For instance, if you take a 350 Chevy gas engine and a 350 Olds diesel engine and weigh them side by side, the Oldsmobile will come out about 45 pounds heavier. Well, that's from the nickel content that was put into these blocks. They were extremely strong. And so therefore, General Motors chose Oldsmobile to do this. The first blocks, the 350D blocks, came out from 78 to 1980. They had an enormous amount of flaws and problems. In the rush to get this engine to production and out in the car market, many of these engines weren't prepared correctly or well enough. For instance, many of the blocks were still green. They didn't have time to cure well enough. For instance, I'll show you an example. You pour some concrete for a sidewalk in the forms, and you want it to be set up well enough so in the morning you can take the forms off and it'll be all right. Well, throughout the night, some little dog or cat comes and walks along and puts their little footy prints in it. When it's still green, it hasn't cured, and now you're stuck with footy prints in your concrete. Same thing with this block. There was no footy prints in the block. That's not what I'm trying to say. The blocks didn't have time to cure and get done setting up. Therefore, the head bolts weren't drilled deep enough in the surface of the deck of the block. The main bolts weren't also drilled deep enough. They could have gone another quarter of an inch. That doesn't sound like much, but when we have so many threads per inch, that's an enormous amount. The 350 Olds already suffered from only 10 bolts as clamping force to hold each head down. What that's holding back is a massive 22.5 to 1 compression, astronomical amount of cylinder pressure with only 10 bolts. Now you don't have enough surface area or threads per inch of a bolt to hold it down. Unfortunately, these engines were snapping head bolts, blowing head gaskets, main caps coming off, and even crankshafts busting. They had a lot of unhappy customers. And what happened is, a lot of the times in the dealership, You had a vehicle that was possibly still under warranty, a 3-year, 36,000-mile warranty. These vehicles got brought in. Many technicians didn't really know how to work on a diesel per se. They did their best. But what happened is on some of these head bolts, they're called a torque to yield bolt. I have an original head bolt right here. And what happens on a torque to yield bolt, when you put it in and start to tighten it down, you go in phases or steps. You tighten it up so much, you stop. You tighten it up a little more, and you finally reach the maximum torque or desired, say 150 foot-pounds. Well, what happens is these threads stretch on these bolts. That's a one-time use bolt. Many times, the bolts that were taken out that weren't broken, they were put back in and reused again. I'll show you an example. This is an original 1978 Oldsmobile diesel service manual. I'll quote from right down here at the bottom. Therefore, fasteners removed from the car should be saved for reuse in the same locations whenever possible. Really. Honest to God's truth. Right there. Yeah. Torque to yield fasteners. You don't reuse these. On many engines today with an aluminum head, on a blowed head gasket, this is the first thing that gets canned in the trash, is the old head bolts. You always reuse you always get new head bolts, pardon me. Yeah, you don't ever reuse those. Sure. Like I said, the blocks weren't drilled deep enough. The main caps weren't drilled deep enough. That was on the early blocks. They were called 350D blocks. Well, after 1981, with all the owner complaints and cars coming back to dealerships, unhappy customers, it was just a floodgate of problems. And during that time, Oldsmobile had done their best to address some of those, not all of them, when they came back out with what's called the 350DX block. The head bolts in the deck head were drilled deep enough. In the main cap body, they were drilled deeper, and they went to a 1/2-inch bolt. They still only had 10 bolts to use to hold down, but that made a big difference in it. Some of the other things, they gave them a bigger oil pan. They only had 5-quart pans. These had 7-quart pans. A major difference. That didn't cure and take care of all the problems, but it was a start. They tried, but as we all know, what happened, the 350 Olds diesel was actually the reason for what we now know as the Lemon Law. Vehicle is brought back in 3 different times for the same concern. The dealership and or the manufacturer has to buy that vehicle back, right? And there were many unhappy customers, unfortunately. But what I'm trying to do today is throw a little education out there along with the build that I'm doing, and just trying to help somebody out if they're trying to do the same thing. This is Randy at Olds Diesel, and I'll catch you next time. Thank you.